Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining me for day 4 of APIs Revisited, part of Digital Leaders Week. And in today's Appy Hour, I'm joined by James Heward, Solution Architect at Scott Logic. If you have a question for James, pop it into the question box and we'll take as many as we can at the end. And if you've missed any of the other Appy Hours taking place this week, you can access all of the recordings on the Scott Logic website, and I'll put that web address in the chat box shortly. You'll also be able to download the white paper that accompanies this webinar series by clicking the same URL in the chat box or by filling in your survey at the end. Now, if you've watched any of the previous Appy Hours this week, you'll know that we're using our surveys to support a very good cause. Throughout Digital Leaders Week, Scott Logic is donating £5 to the Altitude Foundation for every completed survey. The survey takes just 60 seconds to complete, and I'll give you more information about how to access this and tell you a bit more about the charity after James's presentation, and we'll be able to see just how much money we've managed to raise as a result of today's event. So let me now introduce you to today's speaker. James Heward is a solution architect with 15 years of software design and development experience. Prior to joining Scott Logic, he's had a varied career which has included directing machine learning research, founding, leading and exiting a software startup, and designing mission-critical trading platforms at Tier 1 investment bank. Since bringing his passion for good design to Scott Logic, James has advised clients on technical strategy and architected solutions across the financial services, energy, and public sectors. When not working, James can usually be found on the golf course, flitting equally between being frustrated and delighted, which I imagine is the anguish of most golfers. Anyway, without any further delay, let me pass you over to your speaker for today, James.
Thank you, Claire, for that introduction, and hello everyone. Today I am going to be talking to you a bit about API strategies. So first of all, we're going to cover why you might need an API strategy or why you might need to be developing APIs. Then we'll talk a bit about what we mean by an API strategy and the different considerations that could lie within it. Finally, we'll kind of wrap up with some closing thoughts. Let's get started. Before talking about API strategies, let's take a look at some of the reasons why you might need one in the first place. APIs have grown in popularity and importance over the last kind of 10 years or so, and have now become a fairly mainstream concept. However, most businesses haven't yet embraced APIs to their full extent, and many organizations are still maturing their position on APIs. And often business leaders can consider an API a technical concern, but there's actually many good business drivers for adopting APIs. The first of which, and which is a very common one, is to open up additional channels to market. Over the last kind of 5 to 10 years, proliferation of APIs has been driven by needing to expose mobile apps as well as web apps. And we're using backend functionality to achieve that. And actually the channels that are available to go to market are increasing. We've got mobile and web, but now we have, I guess, partner ecosystems, voice, smart assistants like Alexa and Google Home, and IoT, Internet of Things, is becoming more prevalent as well. So more broadly, APIs can provide you a route to provide multiple channels to the market. Focusing in on one aspect of that, if you have a partner ecosystem which has high-touch integrations, this can limit the scalability of being able to onboard partners. An API can allow this to become lower touch, certainly from a technical perspective, and allow you to scale your partner ecosystem up and focus your resources on the kind of marketing and commercial aspects of the ecosystem. Also, following from the multiple channel idea is the idea of servicing niche customer segments. Developing products to serve all customers has its downsides. Products can become really bloated when you're trying to account for regular users and power users. So think about Excel. Most of its functionality goes unused by the majority of people, but it ends up being quite a bloated product to cater for all of those use cases. with an API, it's possible that you can outsource some of the servicing of niche segments by exposing and monetizing your core business competencies, and letting a third party take it all the way to the market. And as long as you're in that value chain, you will continue to derive value and potentially to a larger addressable market. Following on from that point, an API can help innovation to be fostered, both inside your organization and externally. By exposing back-end functionality or business capabilities, you can allow that to be used in unimagined ways, and that can open up new opportunities and new markets, and ultimately subsequent revenue streams for your business. Looking externally, you may feel that you are behind your competitors in terms of offering API. Perhaps your customers are requesting API access, and your market share has been eroded by competitors. Or there could be regulations that are forcing adoption of APIs upon you. Open banking and an upcoming reform of the energy sector are examples of that. And if you're interested in hearing more on this and the opportunities that can present, my colleague Nick Betts gave a talk earlier this week on compliance as an opportunity, which would be worth a listen. And I guess the final reason, which is less of a technical reason, less of a commercial reason, more of a technical reason, is if you adopt APIs and implement them properly following a well-designed API strategy, they can help you improve your IT architecture and ultimately move you towards something where you have more agility and lower cost of delivery from IT. So there's lots of reasons why you might need an API and hence an API strategy. And I guess the key thing is an API strategy isn't just a technical concern, it's a commercial concern as well. So what do we mean by an API strategy? Well, I'm going to look at some different areas of concern within an API strategy that you would need to consider when developing an API or APIs, and then we'll talk in a little bit more detail about each one. The first thing we want to consider is the product strategy, and I'm using the term product here deliberately because APIs are a product. They may not have a UI, and they might not target your end users directly, but they are a product and they should be treated in the same way as any other product or application that you may develop, be that external facing or internal. And in fact, there's examples of very successful companies whose primary products are APIs. For example, Stripe for payments, Twilio for telephony, and even major cloud vendors, their primary product is an API. So in here, we'll touch upon some elements of the product strategy and how you might start to identify the scope of an API. Next, we'll look at technology at high level, and we'll consider some technical principles and capabilities that are required around an API to ensure that you can get maximum value delivered from it. And then we'll touch on what needs to be in place operationally so you can continue to operate your API successfully. And the final area we'll talk about is how to drive adoption of your API, which is vital not just for public APIs, but for private APIs inside your organizations as well, if you want to deliver the maximum value from them. So let's start with the product strategy. What are some of the things we need to consider? Well, as I mentioned, we should be treating APIs like any other product, really. So the first thing we want to consider is who are the users? And for APIs, this can mean two things. This could mean the direct users of your API. That's going to be developers and business analysts and testers, typically. Where they reside. Is this a private API focused on users inside your organization? Or is it a public API where you're opening up the API to anyone who wants to use it? Or is it somewhere in between? Is it a private API with access to a select group of trusted partners? And Scott Logic has a white paper on APIs which define these groups in a little bit more detail, if you're interested. The other group of users are the indirect users of your API. So these are actually the end users of the applications that are going to be built on top of the APIs that you publish. So for a public API, you may not know who they are directly, but for internal APIs, this is typically going to be more tractable. And although part of the appeal of an API is to step back from building direct point solutions for specific use cases and users and to provide building blocks, it is useful to try to understand the business processes that the API is going to be involved in. And on the next slide, we'll talk a little bit more about how we can start to do that. The next thing we'd want to understand is what it is we're mediating via our API. An API provides direct access to some sort of business asset. So which assets are we going to be providing access to? And usually they're going to fall into kind of one of three categories. The first is data. Lots of APIs provide access to valuable data. Think of pricing data or research articles that you might want to mediate access to via an API. The second group is an algorithm or some sort of business logic. We could be exposing some secret source for processing data or delivering insight. So think of machine learning algorithms we might want to expose, or a pricing algorithm that we might want to mediate via an API. And lastly, the third thing is a physical asset. So this could be providing access to compute or storage services, or think of a logistics API or fulfillment API that results in a parcel actually being shipped somewhere. The third thing we're going to want to understand is how we're going to drive value from our API. So ultimately, what's the business model for the API going to be? This is typically more relevant for public APIs than private ones. But as more IT moves on to utility-based pricing, or at least software as a service models, understanding how you could charge for your API is an important consideration, even for private APIs. And this is typically going to be either utility-based, so based on usage, or subscription-based, with some sort of time-based with limits of accessing functionality. And also, is this going to be tiered? Are you going to have tiered access, which providing different access to features or usage or SLAs across that? And the final thing I think it's important to consider is why people might not want you to have an API. And I'm mostly thinking of objections from within an organization here. An API does require a shift in thinking of where the value your organization can bring to users is. And it potentially means giving up some control of the end user experience. So this can be difficult for an organization to swallow. My colleague Gray Mods has a talk called Think Workflow, Not App, which starts to touch upon some of these things in a bit more detail. But some of the objections you might come up against are technical objections. By exposing direct access to functionality, you could be raising scalability concerns, particularly if your API is backed by legacy technology. And it does increase the attack surface from a security perspective as well. People may be concerned that you'll lose control of the end user. Becoming a step in a larger workflow means you potentially aren't as visible to the end user as much, and you lose some control over the end user's experience. Again, that may or may not be a problem, but it is something to consider as an objection. And by exposing your business capabilities, you're exposing them potentially to competitors to use as well. So there could be a risk of cannibalizing sales or a negative competitive impact. On the other hand, it might allow you to service niche segments of the market better than you do at the moment. So although you're taking a smaller piece of the workflow, it might be an overall larger market you can address. And these are all valid concerns, and that there's no right answer necessarily to them, but they're something that you should consider when considering how you're going to develop your APIs, not just from a technical perspective, but I guess in the round. So I've talked a little bit about how embracing APIs requires a little bit of a shift in mindset to being a potentially smaller part of an overall value chain in delivering solutions to end users. And what I'm going to talk about next is why that's the case, and how you can start to understand where you're really offering value and using that to shape the scope of APIs to deliver that. And here I'm going to present a soup to nuts view. It might well be for your case, the universe is more constrained and already well understood. However, sometimes it can be useful to take a step back and look at the bigger picture. And this is going to be an iterative process that ultimately is going to help to answer the 4 areas identified on the previous slide: the who, what, how, and the why not. So as any good product development should start, we start with the users. And this could be at various levels. It can be the direct users, or it could be the potential end users of your API, or the applications rather that are built on top of your API. And both of those will need to be understood to an extent. And this is, I guess, where having good market research and customer segmentation can help, and some UX practices can help here to identify the different user groups that you want to be addressing. Once you've found some user groups, starting with a specific user group and understanding their goals. and understanding the business processes and the workflows that they're going to take part in to fulfill those goals. This will help to identify other actors in the flow and the actions that they and the other parties take. It'll help you to identify the applications, or at least the types of applications that they're using to achieve those goals, and the data that's going to be flowing throughout that to realize those goals. And again, techniques that can help here are kind of traditional business analysis, and things like UX workshops and event storming from domain-driven design can help you to understand those business processes. So far, this is really no different to developing a standard application or a product. But the next steps where we can start to shape it a little more towards an API-centric model. Once you have the business processes in place, the next key step is to identify the capabilities that are required to fulfill the steps of those business processes. And for APIs, really, capabilities are the key. An API is a direct exposure and a direct mapping of some business capability. And that's really the key difference between an API economy and an application economy. In an API economy, you can have a much finer grained functional decomposition of value chains and business processes than you typically have in an application economy. So you're taking a smaller piece in an overall slightly more complicated process potentially. And again, for more on this point, I'd point you to my colleague Graham's talk on workflow, not app. Once we've identified the capabilities that we want that are involved in a process, we can look at how those fit within our organizational capabilities and which of those we might want to mediate via an API. And that's how we can start to shape what the APIs are going to be. So that starts to become the what in our product strategy. In turn, that is going to then refine the who that's targeting. And again, we continue to iterate on this process to understand how we shape what the API is going to be, who it's going to be targeting, how it should be priced, and so on. The next area I'd like to touch on is the second of the four areas, which is technical considerations. And I'm not going to go into detail on specific technologies here, but first of all, I'm going to look at some key principles from a technology perspective. And we're going to look at two sides of the coin. We're going to look at principles for the producer of the API and principles for the consumer of the API and what they care about. And then in the next slide, we'll look at some of the technical capabilities that will be required to wrap around an API and successfully deliver on some of these principles. So looking at the producer first, the first principle to consider is control. And I guess I mean this in a broad sense. The producer of an API should be in control of it. Often legacy problems arise because the producer of a product or an application doesn't have total control. They may have in the past, but that's potentially been eroded over time. Again, my colleague Richard Edwin has a talk earlier this week on how APIs can be used to start to tame legacy if you have more interest in that topic. So we want to make sure we have control of who uses our API, of how they access it, of how it behaves under various usage conditions, and of how it can be changed over time. The next thing we want to consider is automation. APIs can expose you to a greater volume of requests and also a greater diversity of requests than an application with a purely private API for that application. So automation can be really important. Automating releases and rollbacks through things like CI/CD or Canary and Blue-Green releases. Automated monitoring and alerting to make sure you can understand how your API is behaving. Automated documentation generation. Documentation is really important for APIs, and we'll come on to that in a little bit more detail in the subsequent slides. But making sure your documentation is always accurate and up to date with your API. And automated testing to ensure that the quality of your API remains high. And the last point I'd like to touch here in terms of principles for producers is that APIs should consider from the outset how they're going to evolve. Today's APIs are tomorrow's legacy. So ensuring that they can evolve in a controlled manner from the outset is really important. An application with a UI and a private API is totally in your control to evolve the backend and its internal API. As soon as you have multiple consumers external from your team, you'd need a strategy in place for how the API is going to evolve. For the consumer side of the coin, I'm going to look at three broad principles. The first of which is making it easy to try. We want to make it really easy for users to try out your API. So we want to try and make it as low barrier to entry as possible for people to try it out. Ideally make it self-service with documentation, make the pricing attractive and so on. Secondly, we want to make it easy to use. We don't want to do any weird things with our API design. We want to be following best practices in terms of how the API is designed. Again, I won't get into any technical details on that. Mark Jose's talk, as I mentioned before, will go into some more detail on that if you're interested. And we want to generally make our API easy to understand. We want to use common terminology. If there's terminology in your domain that's well understood, we want to use that. And the final one is to make the API easy to live with. And this is covering things like security and trust and availability, but also on a technical level, again, how the API will evolve over time. How will backwards compatibility be handled? How will deprecations be handled? As a consumer of an API, I want to, if I'm buying in to use an API, I want to understand if I'm in this for the long haul, how am I going to evolve with the API, and how is the API going to evolve over time? So we've touched on some principles, and now we can look at some supporting capabilities that can help to realize those principles. And these are capabilities that can be wrapped around any API that you're implementing and help to ensure that those principles are met. I'm going to start with the control-related components. So firstly, we're going to need a mechanism for authenticating clients and for authorizing them to access certain resources. There's a number of widely adopted technologies that can fulfill this role, and it's certainly an area where building something from scratch is almost certainly the wrong thing to do. Authentication authorization can be complex, and there are standards emerging that are widely adopted. Things like OAuth and OIDC are kind of becoming the de facto way to authenticate human and programmatic clients. And they support integration with SSO and federated identities, such as using your GitHub or Facebook credentials to log in. And there's lots of off-the-shelf solutions that can do this and ensure that best practices are followed. The next area is user management, which is closely related to authentication. So how are we going to manage the users of our API? How are they going to be onboarded? How will access credentials be issued and managed? For example, password resets and things like this. Again, this is an area where there are many off-the-shelf solutions that can be leveraged. Things like Okta, Auth0, Keycloak all provide user management functionality. And it's unlikely that this functionality is a core competency of your business, so it's probably not something you should be spending a lot of your own development resource on and building from scratch. Next, in a general sense, is controlling the traffic to your API. And this is a broad topic, covering everything from DDoS prevention, all the way to system-level traffic management through throttling, and down to individual user account traffic control to protect against bad actors or to enforce usage plans. And there's many ways to implement such functionality, and common approaches are to mediate access to your API through an API gateway or an ingress controller, which can provide a control plane and offer the broad traffic management capabilities. And it also keeps this kind of cross-cutting concern out of your backend business logic and allow your backend business logic to focus on delivering the business capability and lift out the kind of cross-cutting concerns away from that. And not necessarily, again, related to APIs, but in addition to the north-south traffic management, so user requests coming in and being fulfilled, east-west traffic management, so traffic management between services that might be backing your API to fulfill an API request should be considered as well. Potentially adopting things like zero trust networking is a good best practice for modern service design here too. And lastly, in terms of control is billing. And obviously this is only relevant if you intend to monetize your APIs and primarily for public-facing APIs. Similar to user management, there's lots of off-the-shelf solutions that can take care of lots of the complexities here, particularly around subscription and utility-based pricing, and offer integrations with things like API gateways to ease that process. The next thing I'd like to touch on is adopting standards for your API. This can include investigating whether there's any applicable public standards to your domain that can be implemented. So things like open banking or ISO 20022 for payments, but also wider than this, and kind of playing into the principle of least surprise and making it easy for clients to understand and use. If your organization is implementing multiple APIs, perhaps adopting common formats, common naming conventions, common error response formats, and so on. and potentially adoption of documentation standards such as OpenAPI can help be consistent here. And closely related to that is the adoption of patterns when designing APIs, again, to make it easy for consumers to use. And this can cover a broad range of things, again, with the goal of being consistent. For example, application of REST patterns, which many APIs claim to do, but few actually do. And again, for more detail on this, my colleague Mark's talk will delve into this in a bit more detail. As I've already touched on, how APIs evolve is a really important thing to consider. And it's something to be considered early in the design process, because it's very difficult to bolt on after the fact. So how your API is going to evolve over time. There are many techniques for versioning API resources and payloads, and handling potentially deprecations. And there's lots of, technically there's lots of ways to do this, and it'll depend on the technologies that you implement your API with, which I guess is the last part. What are the technologies you use to implement your API? And here I'm talking about the data formats, protocols, transports, interfaces, implementation languages that you'll use to implement your business logic and expose that to your clients. So I guess the summary here is, on top of actually implementing the business logic of your API, there is lots of concerns to take into account that wrap around your API and help to make sure it's been implemented properly and that you can deliver maximum value from it. On to the third area of concern of an API strategy, which is the operational considerations. And again, I mean this in a broad sense. And it's also not really any different to the considerations you would make for a traditional application, or certainly a SaaS offering. Firstly, there's support. How are you going to support your users? An API can potentially expose you to a different set of users than you would with an application. Rather than being exposed directly to end users, you can be exposed to the direct users of your API, which are typically more technical. So that can be a slightly different mix of support, which has a more technical bent to it. So from a resourcing point of view, that needs to be considered. And one technique that can actually really help to support an API is the use of a developer portal, which is a site that sits alongside your API and provides things such as sandbox environments, self-service onboarding, access to well-structured and potentially interactive documentation, examples of how to use the API and so on. And that's an operational concern, but it's also something that's useful from a promotional point of view, which we'll come on to on the next slides. The next thing that's important is measurement. And again, I mean this broadly, but covering primarily a few key areas. So one of them is understanding how your API is being used. So what resources are being used in your API? What's the patterns of usage? And that can help to inform future development. It can help to give you some insight into where people are driving value from your API. So you can focus on the areas which are delivering value. Understanding any errors that are coming through your API, possibly as a consequence of misuse. That can inform you that there's maybe an area where the design of the API could be better, or maybe the documentation could be improved. Understanding the performance of your API under different usage patterns is important, allowing you to preemptively handle that. And also communicating the status of your API. APIs are expected to be available 24/7. So having good monitoring and alerting so that you can communicate the status of your API and you can meet your SLAs and your expectations is important as well. And finally, and related to measurement, is cost modeling. And again, it's not specific to APIs. However, APIs are increasingly getting built on elastic or metered infrastructure. So it's possible to understand the cost per request coming to an API. And that can inform areas, again, focus of improvements to reduce cost, but also to inform the business model going forwards. And the next thing I'm kind of shoehorning a bit into the operations section, but it's something to be aware of, is any legal considerations that might affect your API. Again, it's not specific to APIs, but I'm highlighting it just to make that point, that because you're building an API, not an application, doesn't reduce the legal considerations necessarily. And because you're also building what is potentially a more granular component that could be involved in more use cases, also without geographic borders as well. Understanding your legal responsibilities is still important. So it could be far-ranging legislation, such as GDPR, and particularly if your API involves the submission of user-generated content, that can raise considerations around data sovereignty, data retention, and data controller or processor status, which your customers may want to understand your position on. And for a more general and kind of deeper discussion on compliance with APIs and how that can potentially present an opportunity, my colleague Nick Betts' talk earlier this week touches in more detail on that. The final area I'd like to touch on is the promotion of your API. And this is not just for public APIs, it's important for private APIs as well. For public APIs, primarily, it's all about providing a carrot to encourage users to try your API. And so there's some things you can think about here. The first one, as I've touched on already, is a developer portal, which is really useful from an operations point of view. But from a promotion point of view, developers look for APIs that are really well documented, that have a good developer portal, they make it easy to try and use. So it's a good tool for encouraging people to use your API as well. Developer evangelism is a technique for marketing to developers, which largely involves having technical people who can give presentations, can write blog posts and articles, attend relevant meetups to talk around your domain and around potentially the products and the uses of the products that you're creating, and to demonstrate those benefits to relevant developer communities. Potentially, this can even help to directly helping users on board to your API, which does bear a high cost, but particularly if you're migrating people away from a legacy solution to an API solution, ultimately that might deliver you a return on investment if you can deprecate your legacy solution sooner. And lastly, and really importantly, is building a community, which kind of follows from the developer evangelism piece. The goal of that really is to build an active community of users of your API. And this can be really useful to provide input into future development. Also to have the community itself start to spread the usage of your API through word of mouth, and potentially to provide a partially outsourced support function. Some examples of companies with great API communities are Stripe and Twilio, who have developed really that add a lot of value to users of the API, and they also provide a competitive moat as well. There is, of course, much more to marketing to developers, which is beyond the scope of this talk. But this is really just an intro to saying something you should consider when you're considering building an API out. For private APIs, we also have the stick option as well as the carrot. And the balance between the two will be something that is organization and situation specific. But there are certainly a few techniques that can be applied as sticks to drive adoption of your API, particularly if you're looking to migrate users from a legacy solution towards a new API as well. And these largely relate to re-exerting control over the usage of your products that could have been lost over time. So obviously, if we have an established billing model, we can increase the cost of the legacy solution, although that's rare that legacy solutions will have been built with that in mind. We can, of course, provide guidance about the deprecation of the current solution and how to migrate to the new API. And that can be done with plenty of warning and targeted to your current user base in phases, so people can secure budgets and so on. On the harsher end of the stick, we can start to discourage use of an existing solution by selectively degrading its performance, for example, by introducing latency or making certain operations slower, potentially introducing latency between data replication. So we can provide a nudge for people to move towards a newer solution. And ultimately, we can start to restrict access on a case-by-case basis to functionality or to certain user groups as we really want to actually deprecate the existing solution and move people across. So this is just a brief overview of some techniques, but hopefully should give you a flavor of some of the considerations you can make when you're embarking on the development of your API. So to summarize, developing an API strategy, the key thing is to treat APIs like any other product. There are some specifics, but they're not a purely technical exercise, and they should be developed holistically. It should involve expertise across product, technology, marketing, commercial, and considering a number of dimensions. On the product side, Who is it we're going to be targeting, both directly and indirectly? What is it we're going to be providing, and what's the business model we're going to be using to release value from our API? And to do that, we need to understand the users and their workflows, and ultimately the capabilities that we're going to mediate through our API. From a technology point of view, we need to wrap certain capabilities around our API to meet certain principles so that we can control our API and we can make it easy to use, easy to try, and easy to live with. From an operations point of view, being able to really understand how our API is being used and to support users of that effectively. And promotion, to ensure that users can find our API and that we can reach them and encourage them to adopt our API. So that's all I had to say today. Thank you for your time, and I'll now hand back to Claire.